Hello, you are listening to 1 in 2, a Manchester Cancer Research podcast, brought to you by the University of Manchester and the Manchester Cancer Research Centre. With 1 in 2 of us receiving a cancer diagnosis at some point in our lifetime, it has never been more important for our research to improve the outcomes for people affected by cancer. I am your host, Sally Best, and throughout this series, I will be speaking with Manchester cancer researchers about their innovations, discoveries, and projects that are changing the landscape of early detection. In this episode, we speak to Professor Emma Crosbie about her research in womb cancer and the breakthrough she made in discovering a link between Lynch syndrome and womb cancer. We discuss the steps Emma and her team took to change NICE guidance on testing for Lynch syndrome for women with womb cancer, and what this now means for the many women and their families with this disease. Hi Emma, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering if you could first introduce yourself and provide an overview of your research into womb cancer.
So yes, I'm Emma Crosbie. I'm a Professor of Gynaecological Oncology here at the University of Manchester, and my research interests really focus on screening, prevention and early detection of womb cancer.
Okay, and you're a clinical academic.
That's right.
So what is that? What does that kind of entail, and what made you choose that route?
So yes, I am a clinical academic, and essentially that means I spend half my week looking after patients with gynecological cancer. I'm a surgeon, so that means that I am involved in their surgical care, and the other half of my week is involved in doing cancer research. And so that's a really, really rewarding career, because the clinical side allows you to see the unanswered questions in your specialty, to see where particular tests might not be very effective, where treatments might have bad side effects, where cancers might come back, and allows you to ask the kinds of questions that might enable you to make things better. So being a clinical academic gives you the opportunity to make a big difference, not just for the patient that you're caring for that day in clinic or in surgery, but really for populations of patients. So patients of the future, in terms of making the management, their management strategies better, more research-based, and really trying to innovate and improve their lives.
So, I mean, I'm getting from that you not only treat individuals at a kind of individual level, but also a population level that isn't kind of just the patient in front of you. Do you feel like that's very beneficial to the line of work that you're in?
Yeah, because I'm really interested in screening, which is essentially a public health intervention. So it's not about an individual patient in that case. It's about screening a whole population of individuals at risk in order to find those that are at increased risk of cancer, for example. So it is useful to be able to do research that thinks about the whole population rather than an individual patient.
So, Emma, you do a lot of work around gynecological cancers, and personally, I'd love to cover it all, but we don't have time for that. And so I'd like to use this time for you to focus on your research into womb cancer, and particularly a genetic condition you've worked on called Lynch syndrome. Please, could you tell me and the listeners what Lynch syndrome is and its connection to certain types of cancer?
Yes, sure. So Lynch syndrome is the most common inherited cancer predisposition syndrome that's thought to affect around 1 in 300 of the general population, yet only 5% are aware of their diagnosis. It is caused by an inherited mutation, or called a pathogenic variant, affecting one of the 4 mismatch repair genes called MLH1, MSH2, MSH6 and PMS2. And essentially, altogether, those 4 genes are involved in making sure that when DNA replicates, it does so faithfully. And so a defect in one of those 4 genes causes an increased risk of certain types of cancer. And those are bowel cancer, womb cancer, ovarian cancer, and some more rare cancer types. But the reason why I'm interested in Lynch syndrome is because womb cancer is often the first cancer in women with Lynch syndrome, and therefore it offers a really unique diagnostic opportunity, because if we can identify women as having Lynch syndrome, then they can protect themselves and their family members from future cancers by taking an aspirin every day and being involved in bowel cancer screening. And these 2 things have been shown to save lives in Lynch syndrome. And so when I first started looking at Lynch syndrome and womb cancer, I realised that there was just a massive disparity in care in terms of what was available for people with bowel cancer and Lynch syndrome and what was available for people with womb cancer and Lynch syndrome. So for bowel cancer, it was already recommended that everybody be screened for Lynch syndrome. There was an established Lynch syndrome testing pathway in place. There were national and international clinical guidelines and also evidence-based cancer surveillance. But none of this was true for womb cancer. And so I wanted to do something about that.
Okay, so you mentioned Lynch syndrome is linked to both the development of bowel cancer and womb cancer, and there was a big difference in those being screened for Lynch syndrome and those with bowel cancer versus those with womb cancer.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you got a handle on how big that difference was, and also why do you think that was?
So we noticed that here in Manchester there was a very kind of ad hoc way of screening people with womb cancer for Lynch syndrome. So we kind of did it if they were particularly young when they got womb cancer or if they were known to have a strong family history. And we wanted to know whether that was the case elsewhere or whether there were guidelines in place for who we should be screening. And so we teamed up with the patient support group called Lynch Syndrome UK, and we asked patients with Lynch syndrome, so about 300 patients, and the clinicians who care for them, so gynecologists and pathologists, what the current practice was like in the UK. And essentially what we found was that there's a real postcode lottery with a complete lack of services in some places and this real inconsistency of care that seemed to be underpinned by a lack of evidence and a lack of clinical guidelines. So essentially clinicians were just doing what they thought was best because there were no protocols to tell them what they should be doing.
Okay, so you noticed these disparities and the fact that there was this absence of screening and basically kind of meant that women and their families were more at risk. I'm just wondering what were the next steps in terms of evidence gathering and finding this link and proving it between Lynch syndrome and womb cancer.
So what we did next was we convened a meeting in Manchester called the Manchester International Consensus Group Meeting, and we invited experts from across the UK, from Europe and North America to come and tell us all about Lynch syndrome and womb cancer. So we wanted to know what the kind of state of the art was, if you like, from the real experts in the field. So on the first day, we heard from them and we had an audience full of all kinds of people that would be important for such an event. So we had patients, patient support groups, we had gynecologists, nurses, medical oncologists, geneticists, pathologists, gastroenterologists, and so on. And so those experts told us what the state of the art was. And then the next day we had 4 different working groups where delegates rotated through and we debated topics until we reached a consensus. And essentially that process enabled us to find some important research questions that were unanswered. And these were particularly for women with womb cancer, who we should be screening for Lynch syndrome and how we should be doing it.
So you showed almost 3% of womb cancers are linked to Lynch syndrome and that there wasn't screening in women with womb cancer for the syndrome. So, I mean, theoretically, that policy gap was leaving 3% of women with womb cancer in the dark about a genetic condition they carried. And I was wondering, what are the next steps to ensure this difference was shown in the evidence that you were gathering?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. We first of all carried out a systematic review. So we looked at all the published studies that had previously measured the prevalence of Lynch syndrome in womb cancer. And although these studies were not particularly good quality, we were able to show that around 3% of womb cancers are associated with Lynch syndrome, and that is very similar to the case of bowel cancer. So we know that 3% of bowel cancers are caused by Lynch syndrome, and our systematic review suggested fairly similar levels. And so because the studies that we had found in that systematic review were of poor quality, and by that I mean they were small studies, they didn't test all eligible patients, they didn't compare testing strategies, and they were usually based in private healthcare settings, which meant that only around half of the eligible women had actually taken part in the study because there were financial implications for finding out that they had Lynch syndrome in terms of their insurance policies. So this inspired us to do the PETALS study. So the PETAL study was the proportion of endometrial tumours associated with Lynch syndrome, which was the first UK prospective study that looked at every single patient coming through St Mary's Hospital in Manchester with womb cancer and testing them all for Lynch syndrome, and testing them using all the different types of testing strategies in order to directly compare those testing strategies and find out which was the best one for finding Lynch syndrome in womb cancer. So this study formed the basis of my PhD student's PhD. So that was Dr. Neil Ryan. He was an MRC-funded clinical research fellow at the time. And it was also done in conjunction with Professor Gareth Evans, who is a clinical geneticist here in Manchester, and Professor Ray McMahon, who is a pathologist with a particular interest in this area here in Manchester. And essentially, that study showed again that 3% of womb cancers are caused by Lynch syndrome. But it also showed us exactly how we should be testing those patients in order to find those cases most efficiently.
So how many women did you test, Emma?
500.
Okay. And they were from St Mary's?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm wondering, I mean, you've mentioned that there was kind of that side of things where in America people didn't consent to being tested because of finding out that they had a genetic condition. And I'm kind of presuming that that's to do with the fact that, you know, healthcare and health insurance prices go up. Right, okay. And we don't have that here. But I'm wondering, in kind of this country, did all of these women agree to take part in the study? So did you ask 500 women and they all said yes, or were there kind of 600 that you asked and 100 said no? And I mean, were there any women that were worried of finding out that they had a genetic condition?
So that's a really great question. And actually, that was a really important thing when we were devising the study. We were very worried that women actually wouldn't want to know, and that would then indeed prevent us from doing a good study, because we would, again, have some sort of selection bias. So we would only be testing a proportion of those that were eligible to be tested. But actually what we found was over 99% of women wanted to take part. So we asked 502 and 500 consented to take part. And those two that declined to take part were quite elderly women and didn't have any family members who might be at risk. So there was no benefit to them, or that's how they saw it, to find out that they had Lynch syndrome. But everybody else wanted to take part. You know, they often had been, they'd just been diagnosed with womb cancer, and they often were asking questions about why this had happened to them. That is something that patients do tend to ask a lot. And the fact that it could have been due to a genetic condition that might then put them at risk of other cancers was something they definitely wanted to rule out.
Okay, so it sounds like there's quite a protective aspect in terms of protecting family members.
That's right.
But then there's also, the fact that these women might then go on to develop bowel cancer. I'm wondering, out of these 500 women, were there around 3% with Lynch syndrome in this cohort?
Yes.
And what did you kind of go on to provide them with? Was there any support? Or because I mean, it's quite a large kind of thing to be diagnosed with, and a big conversation that you've then got to have with your family and preventative measures and things.
Yes, it is. It is a big deal to find out that you have a genetic condition that could increase your risk of future cancers and also put your family members potentially at risk. And if we look at it, there were 500 women that we tested, and 3% of that is 16. So it was 16 women who found out that they had Lynch syndrome. Actually, 3 of them already knew. So it was 13 new diagnoses of Lynch syndrome. And all of those women were referred to the clinical genetics department, where they had genetic counselling, which essentially involves finding out which members of their family would be eligible for testing. So that's something called cascade testing, where you find an index case of a genetic condition and then you roll out testing to their at-risk family members in order to find healthy people with Lynch syndrome in whom you could prevent future cancers. So all of those women were offered cascade testing, and they were then enrolled in the appropriate prevention program. So that is, they were either enrolled in a clinical trial to find out which dose of aspirin they should take to prevent future cancers, or they were started on a low-dose aspirin, depending on when they were recruited to the study, because that trial wasn't for the whole duration. And they were also enrolled in bowel cancer screening. So that is when people with no symptoms but who have Lynch syndrome have a camera test called a colonoscopy to look inside the bowel and check for any polyps that could be removed, that could be dysplastic polyps, which means that they are pre-cancer, and therefore removing them can effectively prevent bowel cancer. So that kind of comprehensive package of care was organised through the clinical genetics department.
And I guess there's the side of things that is better in terms of early diagnosis of that syndrome, because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but early diagnosis would kind of mean increased patient outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing, is that if we can prevent cancer, that's brilliant. But even if we can catch cancer at an early stage, then we know that patient outcomes are better, because usually they are cured with their first treatment, and that might be treatment that causes less problems to them because, for example, it's just surgery, than if they needed more advanced treatments, more aggressive treatments for more advanced cancer. So yes, early diagnosis is key to improving outcomes from cancer.
And presumably, I mean, if a woman has Lynch syndrome and kind of is unsymptomatic and has no symptoms of bowel cancer, but actually turns out to have bowel cancer, that would be the early detection side of things.
Yes.
And then in her children, I mean, am I right in thinking it's both boys and girls that would be?
Yeah, so Lynch syndrome is an autosomal dominant condition, which essentially means that a parent passes it on to approximately half of her children, whether they be boys or girls.
Okay. And then for them, it would be the preventative measures and the preventative side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, some of them will be girls who have not had womb cancer. So, in this case, the index case has had womb cancer and she's had treatment for it. But her family members may not have had womb cancer. And therefore, there are things that we can recommend to reduce their risk of womb cancer in the future as well.
God, it's good stuff, isn't it?
It is.
It's good stuff. So just back to the original study, the PETAL study. So within this series, we've talked about health economics, and we've talked about it comprehensively in a few of the episodes that we've covered. But I'm just wondering if there's any health economics portion of this PETAL study.
Yeah, so we teamed up with Professor Catherine Payne, who's a health economist here in Manchester, and we carried out something called a micro-costing study, which essentially calculated the exact costs to the NHS of doing the Lynch syndrome testing. So we compared 4 different testing strategies and worked out how much each of those would cost in terms of diagnosing the patients with Lynch syndrome. So if you think about it, it doesn't sound as if it's going to be cost effective to screen everybody with womb cancer to find the 3% that have Lynch syndrome. But that's really an important piece of information for the NHS to know in order to make it policy that we should be screening everyone with womb cancer for Lynch syndrome. And so it was important for us to gather the costs so that we could understand whether or not it could be cost effective. So that portion of the research was finding the costs. And then we teamed up with Dr. Tristan Snowsill from the University of Exeter to do a formal health economics modelling exercise. And essentially, by putting in the costs that we had gathered in our microcosting study and all the information that we had got from the PETAL study, we were able to show that screening or offering screening for Lynch syndrome to everybody with womb cancer is indeed cost-effective for our NHS.
Okay, so you mentioned as well, you tested 4 methods of screening for Lynch syndrome. Which one did you settle on?
So we settled on the one that was most clinically effective. So the one that found all 16 Lynch syndrome cases. And that was essentially examining the tumour tissue for the presence of these mismatch repair proteins that I talked about, using something called immunohistochemistry, which is essentially staining the tissue and looking to see whether it stains brown, on a very basic level. And then those that don't stain brown are at risk of Lynch syndrome, and they go on to have a blood test, which is the proper test, if you like, for Lynch syndrome. So we could just take a blood test and do genetic testing of all our womb cancer patients, but that's extremely expensive and also, very time consuming and requires a lot, it takes a long time to get a result. Whereas this tumour test is very, very quick. It can be done at the time of, diagnosis and treatment for womb cancer without causing, much backlog in terms of workload. And it effectively reduces the number that needs to have this genetic test.
So, Emma, this is a question that you'll have had before. With this blood test, is there a multi-pronged approach that we can take? Could we test for multiple cancers in one? Because, I mean, if it's expensive, you might as well kind of do multiple while you're there. Am I right? Or
you are absolutely right. However, in this particular case, we are just looking for Lynch syndrome. So if you increase the panel, in other words, you look for more mutations or defects in other genes, then that increases the cost and it increases the workload and the time to get the results. So because in this particular workflow, if you like, we're simply looking for Lynch syndrome because that is the genetic condition that predisposes to womb cancer, then expanding the panel to other genes isn't that cost effective because it's very uncommon that those will be affected in these patients, if that makes sense.
Makes complete sense. So just moving on to my next question, it's looking back on all these findings, how have they been appointed into NICE and what was the process of this?
So right at the very beginning of this, we thought we really want to do research that makes a difference. We want to do research that changes how we care for our patients. And so we approached NICE and said, why is there no guideline to say we should be screening our womb cancer patients for Lynch syndrome? And they said there's no evidence for it. There isn't any good quality research that allows us to create a guideline like that. And so we asked them, well, what research would you need? And they said, well, we need the results of your PETAL study. We also need health economics modelling. We need to know that patients want to be tested. And so that kind of informed how we did our research because we sort of started with the end in mind. We knew what we wanted to achieve through the research and we knew what NICE needed us to show. And so that is how we did our research. And so at the end of that process, when we had done all the work and got the results through, we were then able to approach NICE again and say, you know, the evidence you asked for? Well, here it is. And if we hadn't done the research that we had done, there would still not be enough evidence for them to say we should be offering screening for Lynch syndrome in womb cancer. So we really started with the end in mind.
Absolutely brilliant approach there. Nailed it. And I realised that, I mean, a lot of people might not know what NICE is. So for the benefit of our listeners who might not have heard of it, would you be able to just give a quick overview of the role of NICE and how it plays into clinical practice changes?
Yeah, so NICE is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and essentially they are the body that oversees new guidelines that all clinical trusts in the UK would want to abide by, because these are such high quality guidelines that are informed by the best evidence, and NICE is impartial, so it doesn't, write a guideline because it has a friend that does this particular type of research or has asked for this clinical new test to be brought into clinical care. It's very impartial. It's got transparent processes whereby it looks at the evidence in a very impartial way, in an objective way, and it sort of engages a team of independent experts to appraise the evidence and decide whether or not the evidence is strong enough to be recommending a change in clinical care for our patients here in the UK. So it's really the best way to introduce a change in clinical care is to go through NICE, because the quality of their guidelines is such that most clinical trusts will then want to roll them out.
So, I mean, it's quite comprehensive, and I think that reiterates the integrity that your research has to have. So, I mean, from my perspective, I applaud you for that. It's just amazing.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering, with regards to NICE, what specific guidance is now in place for womb cancer patients, and what does that mean for the kind of future of patients now and in the future?
Yeah, so the research that we did directly fed into the NICE process, and in October 2020, they released new guidance that said that we should be offering screening for Lynch syndrome to all patients with womb cancer using the approach that Manchester showed to be most clinically and cost effective. So essentially what that means is that the UK has now got a mission to start screening all of its womb cancer patients for Lynch syndrome. And this is being rolled out. So it's already happening here in Manchester. It's happening for most of the large cancer centres that deal with womb cancer. And it's being rolled out to the peripheral centres, the cancer units as well. And so it it really has changed what we do. And now it's just part of routine care that we do that tumour test that tells us whether or not a patient's at risk of Lynch syndrome. And then we ask patients if they'd like to have the blood test if they're at risk. And this has basically meant that we are now able to understand better who is at risk of future cancers and enrol them in the right screening programmes for bowel cancer prevention, start them on aspirin, find their family members that might be at risk as well. And essentially, it's just this sort of cascade of identifying people at risk and helping them to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, and I guess, as we've mentioned before, identifying those at risk is part of that prevention and early detection work, which, as we know, is the kind of the route that we want to take if we're going to kind of tackle cancer at the source.
Yes.
For want of a better way to put it.
Yes.
So that's, am I right in thinking that's Diagnostic Guideline 42?
You are. You're absolutely right. Wow. How did you know that?
Can you tell I've done my reading?
I'm very impressed.
P.S.
It is.
So I'm wondering, the mission. So you're saying it's a mission to roll it out. Are there any timelines with that?
So it's happening. So I think this year, next year, I mean, it's about gathering resources. So, you know, pathology departments are hugely under-resourced and understaffed, and it's about trying to introduce it into work streams. So there is a will. Everybody wants to do it. It's just about finding the ability to do it by working out how best to introduce it at each local place. And
I'd like to know about why were you so passionate about getting this evidence and research into NICE guidance? Because I mean, it's an arduous task, and I know it's taken you years and years, and it is now your life's work. And I mean, it's not the only thing you're known for, which is crazy. Absolutely crazy. But yeah, where did your passion come from?
I think I just saw this big difference for bowel cancer and womb cancer and thought, well, that's not fair. Partly because, as I said before, women with Lynch syndrome are much more likely to get womb cancer first than they are to get bowel cancer. And so if we could find that they had Lynch syndrome, then we could potentially prevent them from getting the bowel cancer that, let's face it, has often a much worse prognosis. So womb cancer, you know, we do tend to diagnose it early and often cure it. But my view was, well, there's no point in doing that if we're going to leave this poor woman to subsequently develop a bowel cancer that ultimately kills her. So we need to be doing something now, and we need to be correcting this disparity. It felt like women were getting a bad deal, and I wasn't happy about that.
No, go women, everybody. I guess that's the thing as well. Like, if you're going through one cancer and cancer treatment, it's a hell of a lot for your body to go through.
Yes.
And I mean, presumably going through the next is just kind of another knock.
Absolutely. And, you know, the women that took part in our study were very clear that it was partly about preventing future cancers for themselves. That's why they wanted to take part. But it was really, quite a lot of it was about protecting their children and their other family members. And there was that real altruistic, you know, nurturing side to them that was like, well, if this thing has been caused by a genetic condition and I can help my family member by enabling them to get involved in cancer prevention interventions, then why wouldn't I?
Yeah, completely. I completely understand that. I mean, knowledge is power after all.
Yes, it is.
Emma, what would be your advice to a researcher who wants their research to be adopted into NICE guidelines and don't say coffee?
I think
caffeine.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is to do what we did. So essentially, you need to identify an area of unmet need. So you need to find an area that really needs some work, where there is a real clinical problem, a conundrum, if you like, but there is just a lack of evidence to support a change in clinical practice. And you need to gather the evidence and present it to NICE and ask them to look at it in a formal way so that they can create a new guideline. So it's essentially, as I said before, it's about starting with the end in mind. What is it you're wanting to achieve? What do you need to put in place to achieve that? And essentially working together with NICE to make sure that the research you're doing is going to be effective in that sense.
Fab. Ever thought of motivational speaking? There's a new career path for you there, but don't leave gynae cancer, for God's sakes. We'd all be ruined. I mean, the next kind of point that I'd like to look into is through your research, you've continued to positively benefit the lives of women. And that's women with Lynch syndrome, as well as their family members. And I'm wondering, how does it feel to know that your work is positively changing the lives of all these people? I mean, I think, in terms of being a medic and a doctor, you're benefiting kind of lives on the ward and, like saving lives through A&E and things. But I think looking at this clinically, this is a population level of people that you're helping. And I'd just like to know, how it feels that, number one, you're benefiting lives, and number two, that it's women, and number three, that it's at such a vast population level.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, that is essentially why we do what we do. We do it to make a difference. And it, to have seen the patients being diagnosed and being grateful that they found out that they have this condition is very rewarding. To listen to the patient support groups and the patients themselves to say, this is so important. It's made a real massive difference to our lives to know about this condition. That is essentially why we do what we do. It is to benefit not just the patient in front of us, but groups of patients, populations of patients, and to make a real positive change for the future.
Yeah, I mean, to say, it's all the kind of the kids as well that you're preemptively helping. So, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of people down the lineage as well. Emma, you're always somebody looking to the future. You've got a lot of foresight. What's the future of your research, and, what do you want to be the next stages of this work?
So, obviously, we are identifying people who have got womb cancer, and it's caused by Lynch syndrome. But through cascade testing of their family members, we're finding women in their family who have not had womb cancer, but who are at risk of it. And as I said before, we have bowel cancer screening programs in place to reduce the risk of bowel cancer and prevent bowel cancer in people with Lynch. But there isn't anything that is effective or known to be effective for womb cancer. So again, the clinical service is patchy. Some people are offered annual gynecological surveillance in the form of an ultrasound scan, a hysteroscopy, which is a camera test inside the womb, and a biopsy. And other people are offered nothing. And the people who are offered testing, the testing isn't really fit for purpose because it's invasive. It hurts people. Some people find it quite painful. It's expensive, and we don't really know how often we should be offering it. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of finding a new womb cancer early detection tool, so a screening tool, if you like, that can help us to identify which women need invasive diagnostic testing and which women can be reassured that there is no pre-cancer or cancer sitting there that needs to be looked at. And so we've been looking at this and trying to develop a non-invasive detection tool. And the thing that we're working on at the moment is the possibility of a urine test. So we've had a look in urine, and we've been able to show that you can actually see womb cancer cells in a urine sample of a person who's got womb cancer, and you don't see similar cells in a urine sample from a person who doesn't. And this is quite an exciting finding. Essentially, all it involves is taking a sample that the woman has collected at the toilet and then spinning it down onto a slide and looking at it under the microscope. So it's a very, very simple test, but it actually does work. And we've done it in a small number of people, and we're now rolling it out into a much larger study of 2,000 women, of whom about 100 will have womb cancer, and seeing whether or not the urine test can actually identify those women, because we think that this could be the future. This could be a urine test that could be done at home, that a woman with Lynch syndrome could simply send into the lab every year, and we could say, the urine sample's clear, you don't have womb cancer, you can be completely reassured, or actually we do see some cells and you need to come in for those invasive tests. I think that would completely transform what we currently do to screen for womb cancer and Lynch syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scary thing, a cancer diagnosis, and I think for a lot of people, ignorance is bliss. And if you kind of get over that ignorance is bliss phase and want to kind of be screened and things, the painful aspect of things and the invasive aspect of things can be an additional scare and put women off. So I mean,
a real barrier.
A real barrier, yeah. So I'm guessing, giving women the kind of urine sample, just the ease of it would encourage more women to come forward as well.
Yes, that's the plan.
Which, again, early detection. We love it.
We do.
We love it. And I mean, I've spoken to you and Jen about this. Can we use that urine for anything else? The great power of urine.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we're very excited about the power of urine because we are also looking into the possibility that it could be an alternative way of screening for cervical cancer. And indeed, Jen's work has shown that we can find the HPV virus in urine samples of people who've got cervical precancer. And so actually a urine test might be good to diagnose or to identify people at risk of both cervical cancer and womb cancer. And ultimately, if we could find a biomarker in people with ovarian cancer, then we might be able to actually create a pan-gynae cancer screening tool, which is urine-based. And this is something that I find really exciting. This is the area that I'm really interested in at the moment.
God, you're a gynae goddess.
Thank you.
Gynaecological goddess. That's what we'll have to call you. Change your Twitter handle now, Emma.
Okay.
Well, in America, you have witnessed that women don't come forward for screening of Lynch syndrome because it would increase their kind of health insurance premium.
That's right.
How would you get around that?
I mean, it's really challenging, isn't it? So, I mean, the whole paying for your healthcare thing is very, very difficult. And, there are repeated studies from America showing that even when a person is identified with Lynch syndrome, their family members don't want to be tested for the exact same reason. So they really are at risk because their family member has it and they don't want to be tested. And I think it's a massive challenge. We are so lucky in the UK to have the National Health System. A National Health Service, sorry. It is absolutely amazing because it takes care of all of us and we don't have to worry about how much things cost when deciding on what's best for our health. And I think that it is a real shame that same way of thinking isn't transparent in America because it is private healthcare. So, the rich can have and the poor cannot. And that just seems wrong to me.
Yeah, it's a very sad way that the world works.
Yeah.
And I mean, in terms of other countries, is the testing being rolled out?
So it is in Europe, yes. So our work has actually made it into European guidelines now.
Look at you go. She doesn't stop.
So there are now, the sort of European guidelines for the management of womb cancer are all saying we should be screening for Lynch syndrome using the Manchester approach. So, we're in Europe. Whether we can get into America, I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it? And also, of course, in low and middle income countries where healthcare resources are very slim, I think this might not be seen as a priority, understandably. But, we have hope that we will be able to do some big stuff at least in Europe.
Yeah, keep pushing forward.
Yeah.
And I love that. Manny on the map. We're here. Well, thanks, Emma, so much for talking to me today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. You're an absolute wealth of knowledge. And honestly, thank you so much for just talking to me about yet another one of your kind of life's work, your children, as it were.
Thank you for having me. It's been
so
fun.
good. Yeah, it's so great to talk about pioneer of early detection. We'll go for that one. Another meaning of PED.
Yes.
Prevention and there we go. Prevention and early detection, pioneer of early detection. We love it. Right, well, I mean, thank you everyone for listening. I'll link Emma's work in the blurb and I'll put in her Twitter handle. Follow her on there, keep up with her movements, keep up with her PhD team because they're all doing great stuff. And everything will be linked. So just keep reading. She's great. But thanks for listening and see you all next time. Not see you all. Listen to you all. Speak to you all next time. God.
Thank you very much.
And we're out. If you have been affected by anything you've heard in this episode, please see the show notes for a list of charities and organisations that can help.
1 in 2 was brought to you by the University of Manchester and the Manchester Cancer Research Centre. Listen to our next episode to hear from more of our researchers as they share the innovations, discoveries and projects that are changing the landscape of cancer prevention, early detection and treatment. To find out more about what you've heard today, please see the show notes for this episode, where you'll find a transcript and links to further information and research. Cancer is one of the university's 5 research beacons, showcasing the interdisciplinary collaborations and cross-sector partnerships that are tackling some of the biggest questions facing the planet. To hear more about Manchester's research in advanced materials, biotechnology, cancer, energy and global inequalities, go to manchester.ac.uk/beacons.